Well, first of all, a great feeling of friendship for you. Very precious, precious days and precious evening now. When I began, I wrote philosophy essays that were developed out of courses I taught, and where I thought I had a few, ideas of my own. And I used to write letters to friends, and when I would travel, and sometimes kind of long letters. And out of these letters, little by little, I began to write essays about things that, because when you write a friendly letter, you, on the one hand, want to entertain your friend and share something that was important to me when I was outside the country. And also, one wants to kind of write well. One doesn't want to write a boring letter. And if, for example, I go to the Grand Canyon as an example, I don't just say it was great, because that doesn't share anything. You have to describe it more concretely. So. Then after that, some of these experiences I talked about in meetings, and eventually put them in writing in books. So I came to the practice of writing about the things that moved me most. Sometimes very often it was people that I met, or sometimes even buildings like temples, or landscapes, or events that happened. So the things that were somehow moved me and changed me most, changed my heart, changed my way of looking at things, were different. There were different kinds of things. Sometimes, well, for example, in the Andes, to recognize people who had suffered for 500 years of oppression, and to discover that they had continued to maintain their language and their culture for 500 years, and they were not really destroyed. I mean, their heart, their mind was still strong, and it gave me a very good feeling of the strengths that there are in people. Yeah, there were a lot of them. One I remember was in Varanasi on the Ganges River. So I had gone there for some weeks, and every day I used to go to the river. And soon I met a boy. He was, maybe 10 years old at the time, who had nothing really, but he gave rides on the river to people. It was not his boat, of course. All he had was the ability to give rides, and he spoke some English. But everywhere in the world, I find street people can have a surprising skill in learning in knowing enough English to talk to the foreigners, and also French and German and so on. But in India, it's especially English that remains, even in uneducated people. So every day I would meet him, and he would take me for a ride. And one day when I was leaving, I was there maybe a month, he gave me this small little silver statue of the god Gopal that he had found in the river. So many Hindu people, when they go to the Ganges, they give the river gifts. And he had found this in the mud, this tiny little statue that he gave me. And it was an extraordinary gift. First of all, it was the only thing he had, really. So that if I gave him, he gave me more than I could possibly give him. You know, if I gave him money, even if I gave him a lot of money, it's not the same thing. Because I have a job, I have more money, and so on. But he had only this little statue. And secondly, what was amazing is that this statue was of the god Gopal, but it was also his name. His name was Gopal. So it was an especially precious gift he gave me. And then I think it must have been 10 or 12 years after I returned to Varanasi. And I was walking along the river, and I saw him from a distance. He was now a young man of, 20, 22. But somehow I recognized him from a great distance, and he recognized me. And we ran toward one another. It's such a precious friendship between two men who are so apart. I think, when we think of our friends when we grow up, we think of people like ourselves, people of our same country, town, education. We grow up with the same music, the same movies, and so on. So usually when we think of our close friends, we think of people who are very, very much like ourselves. In this case, I and Gopal were very unlike. He was as completely poor, as poor as one can become, and I'm rich compared to him. In America, I'm not rich, but I'm well off. But compared to him, I'm extremely rich. He has no education, and I have, very high education. He is of Hindu culture and religion, and I have a very weak knowledge of this culture and religion. So in spite of this great distance of language and education and social status, that we could have such dear friends. Of course, I felt a great affection for him, but the fact that he gave me, this statue of his name, and that 12 years later he recognized me from such a distance, means that he felt a great friendship for me. That's one encounter that was very important in my life. And if I could put it in a broader context, maybe, that in our world today, where there's such hatred and misunderstanding and violence between people. Even in Europe, it was horrible, for example, to watch, for example, the former Yugoslavia, where these people used to be one nation and had such hatred and such violence toward one another and broke up into 6 different countries. I think one can become very discouraged and think that it's hard for human beings to get along. And my experience with Gopal was for me a very profound experience, how human beings basically could have love for one another, even if they have no nation or language or religion in common. In America, the slogan is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what the country is supposed to guarantee to its citizens. But the idea of pursuit of happiness means that happiness is somehow outside, and you need methods and to acquire happiness. But I think that's very wrong. I think that happiness is natural. It comes with life and health. I think life is essentially joyous. All life is essentially joyous. I think if one is healthy and if one is without resentment, happiness comes naturally. I think I just think that everyday experience, you wake up in the morning, perhaps after some gloomy days, and suddenly it's springtime and the sun is shining, and you step out of your house, and it's natural to feel the surge of happiness inside. And I think if one is happy, that one spreads happiness around oneself. I mean, not even deliberately, just I think of going to campus in the springtime and see some student in the spring just sort of dancing on the sidewalk heading toward class. And that person is dancing out of their own inner feeling of happiness. But this happiness spreads. Everyone who sees this is given some of this happiness. It makes everyone around him or her to share some of this happiness. So I think happiness doesn't come from the outside, people think that if I had $1 million, life would be different. But people have actually studied and discovered that if you are miserable, if you don't have enough money to take care of your own needs and the needs of your children, and then you acquire enough money, then you become more happy than before. But then if somebody if you win the lottery and you suddenly have $1 million, people have actually studied, people are not more happy that way. I also think of every newborn life. I have experienced often enough the birth of a baby bird, like a baby pheasant, or I remember once there was a quail. I opened the back door once and discovered a quail sitting on eggs in the high weeds, and I went to my class. I came back, and the mother bird did not come back. So I thought she thinks it's not safe. So I put the eggs in an incubator and hatched them. And a couple of weeks later, I came back from class, and the baby birds were just hatching. They were on a shelf in the bedroom, and I opened the incubator, and they were all jumped out, and they were cheeping and full of life and full of curiosity right away. You know, and when you see that, to be born is to born into happiness. That happiness is a the vibrancy inside life. I grew up on the farm, and it's the same kind of experience when a cow gives birth to a calf. As soon as it can stand and is dry and his mother licks it, it runs around and jumping, and you can see it's full of energy and vitality and happiness. I think that what makes us unhappy is resentment, the feeling that other people are doing us wrong, and we want to do wrong to them in return. I think this example, it happens to everybody, that somebody insults you or puts you down or does some harm on your job. And at the time you don't answer them, but when you go home, keep thinking of all the things you would like to say to that person, like to your boss. And of course you can't say them, because you lose your job. But you keep imagining how you would like to put that guy down. You would like to hurt him in return. I think this is a very miserable feeling, when you can't stop thinking of how you would like to hurt him. And it's happened to me too. It happens, I think, probably to almost everybody, that you have this days when you can't stop thinking of how you would like to hurt someone who has humiliated you or put you down. And then after some time, sometimes something changes. You become involved with some other person or in a better relationship. And then finally you realize one day that you're no longer thinking of hurting that guy. And that's such a feeling of relief. It's a feeling of freedom, So it seems to me this resentment, this desire to hurt somebody, is the most miserable feeling. It's the opposite of happiness. Well, I think as a matter of fact, human beings simply do not live one kind of life. And we are taught that the ideal life is to have a family. But I think there have always been people who did not have this kind of life. And also people had families, and they were very horrible families, You read in the newspaper every day that parents murder their own children, and occasionally children murder their parents. So, so very often it doesn't work. And in my case, I never really consciously chose. It just happened this way. I think that it could well have been that I would have met someone and, had a family of my own. But it sort of didn't happen, and I didn't particularly search for it. I think if I would have searched for it, I could have found that kind of life, but I didn't particularly search for it. But on the other hand, a great number of people, especially in our modern society, live outside the family. And there have always been people who have chosen this way of life. So I think there are good things and bad things. In other words, if you don't have a family, you risk hours and days, maybe even weeks of feeling lonely. If you have a family, maybe you risk hours and days and weeks of feeling confined, being limited in in the people that you know and interact with. I mean, perhaps you've had this experience. So many people that you knew and were friends, they get married, and then you no longer see them anymore because, they don't have time for anybody outside. So that's also a kind of limitation. I think in a way I never settled down. Like when you're a student, even if you choose to study one thing, you always have the idea that the future is open and maybe different things will happen or more things will happen. In other words, it's not going to stay this way. And so when I was a student, I had no money, and so I couldn't travel. In the summer, I had to try to find a job. And after I finished my studies and had a job, then I wanted to start to see the world. And I guess I never got tired of it. Like, every time I have some free time, I keep thinking of all the wonderful places to go to. And also, because I was always thinking about, in a kind of philosophical way, I was thinking of new forms of life, new ways of life, new paths in life that I was encountering. So, in a sense, it was a little bit like being a student. You had the idea that there were multiple paths to take. And the more I lived and went places and met people, I kept appreciating more and more different ways of life and different forms of... So I think I never really wanted to, settle down. I had this is a kind of very recent encounter. So I get a telephone call one day from somebody who says, I'm Jim Switzer, I'm Rob Switzer's son, and we're coming through Baltimore, and do you have time to meet? So it turns out Rob Switzer was a former student who's been teaching in Cairo for about more than 30 years. And he had two sons. And this one, the older one, I had met when he was 15 years old. So I had not seen this person since he was 15. So when he visited, I discovered he's now 29. He's an engineer. He had an excellent job in Manhattan in an engineering company. He also met a woman, also an engineer in a different company in Manhattan. They fell in love. They married. They quit their jobs. They quit their apartments. They got on bicycles for their honeymoon. And were going to travel around the world on a bicycle for a year. So when I met them here, first of all, I discovered this young man who I had not seen since he was 15 years old, and I discovered his wife, and I thought they were both wonderful. But I also was completely wowed by what they were doing. I mean, here are two young people who have an excellent position in life. So from now on, it could be just etc. Same job, every day in the work, same work, excellent salary in Manhattan. So I suppose they were thinking, is this all there is in life? For the next 30 years, is it going to be the same thing every day after day, you know? And they decided, no, we're going to get on a bicycle and see the world. I think, you know, to me that was so wonderful. I was full of admiration. I admired people because I think that too many people, you know, at 20 years old, you settle down, you get married, you have a house, a job, and then for the next 50 years, it's the same thing. So when they finish their honeymoon after a year, they're going to have to start all over again. You know, now they have no job and no apartment. I haven't seen them since, so I don't know what they are doing now. But I think it's... Well, the first thing you think is that it's a very strong thing to do. You must have a great deal of strength and self-confidence to do that. So when they're traveling on a bicycle, they depend on the hospitality of strangers. There's this kind of network of people who will offer them a bed for the night called warm showers. And so on the way from New York, they had stopped at some stranger's house, and that person gave them a night's sleep. And so along the way, they will meet many, many people, because every night, they won't stay. They're not going to be camping, and they're not going to be sleeping in a hotel. So they're going to be sleeping on people who have offered them a bed for the night. So they're going to meet 365 new people, or maybe probably some places they will stay several nights and maybe a week or 2 weeks at a place. So. Oh, the cruelty of our world, and the cruelty to people, and also the cruelty to our environment and to our fellow creatures.
How do you cope with it?
For me, I could do very little, but in my writing, I have tried to often I call people's attention to cruelty. And unfortunately, that's about all I have been able to do. Of course, there are people who do much more. There are people, I think the people that are most extraordinary are the people who work in refugee camps, for example. Also doctors and nurses. Doctors and nurses generally, but especially doctors and workers who choose to devote their lives without money and in refugee camps. Sometimes these people do it for a limited time. So, for example, in Central America, I discovered the children who are born with a cleft lip. So it could be sewed together in a simple operation. But if nobody does this, they have a very, it reduces life for them very much. First of all, they're not beautiful. Secondly, sometimes they can't even talk or eat properly. So there are American doctors who go down for 2 weeks to the poorest parts of Central America and to find these children and sew them up. And it brings happiness to lives right away. And I was delighted to discover when I was in Thailand that there was the same practice. There were young doctors in Thailand who were doing exactly the same thing. So I think there are people who do much more than I have ever done. Here in Baltimore, I discovered these two people who are now such dear friends. I discovered them about 3 years ago. They're retired. They're about 75 years old. They were in a marine insurance business, and they came to move to Baltimore, and they discovered that there are 5,000 homeless children in Baltimore. So they have created these packages of food that are nourishing and tasty and require no refrigeration or cooking. And they have, it's their own project to make these food packages and distribute them. It's so wonderful when you think of all the people who are retired and 75 years old and they don't do anything. They just watch television, So there are so many people who do much more than me. Well, it does seem that people, the main thing, a big force in people's life is that they feel insecure. They feel afraid. I think, for example, just a simple thing of going to another country where you don't know the language. You to go to Mexico. There's so many people in America for their vacation, they go to Florida or California and so on, but they would never think of going to Mexico, which is really a much more interesting trip than to go to California. But they're always talking about how would I get along if I don't know the language? Then they're always afraid of being cheated. I notice this so often. If you listen to travelers just in the airport and so on, talking about being cheated. I remember long ago in Myanmar, which is a country very closed, and if you got you only got a week visa at most, and if you got a week visa, it was if you had American dollars or European currency, it was incredibly cheap. Nothing cost anything. But I remember in the airport listening to young people talking about whether they paid too much for the transportation, for the rickshaw. And the rickshaw maybe cost them $1 for all day, but maybe it should have been only 50 cents. And often I heard even young people arguing with taxi drivers and shopkeepers about a price that even if they paid too much, it was very little. And why do people feel that way? Somehow they want to be in control. They're afraid that they're being cheated. And somehow that makes them feel vulnerable. I think that's a big feeling in a lot of people. So as a result, you see so many people, they will not go alone or even with their spouse to another country. They will only go in a tour group, an organized tour with a tour guide. So I'm surprised, I'm really kind of surprised how fearful people are, even to go to Europe. I mean, so many Americans are somehow afraid to go to a country like France, which is a perfectly prosperous country where, virtually every hotel clerk and every restaurant, somebody speaks English. but they're insecure about going to another. I think this is so, I don't know, it's such a big motivation in people. You know, in the 60s, it was so different with young people. Young people really felt that you don't need money, you don't need to be rich. When you're young, you have to have as much life as possible. So you make love, not war. You know, go to India, go to Japan, learn Zen, try every drug, you know, sing every song. Somehow there wasn't this fearfulness in that generation. And now it seems to me so many people are fearful. And as a result, they don't live. I even felt that in the academic world. Like when I was a young student, I felt that a lot of my teachers were rather poor, that they really were not in love with teaching, and they were not very good at it. But somehow they didn't have the courage to quit and look for something else to do. And every once in a while somebody did, you know, quit, and I always admired that. I always admire people who are 50 years old and decide to quit their job and do something else. I'm not really, unfortunately, I was not much of a dancer. I went to a little country school, and we learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we certainly didn't learn any team sports, any athletics, or any social skills. So, of course, I could have learned much later, but unfortunately, I didn't.
What about the experience in Rio when you went to the carnival and you?
Yeah, that was the one time. Yeah, to me, Carnival was one of the really important experiences. Because the first time I saw it was when the Iraq War had broken out. And I was feeling really in a funk. I was really feeling depressed. Like after all these hundreds of years of civilization, the richest countries assembled to fight war for the control of cheap petroleum. So it was like the wars of, in fact, they called it the Black Gold. So it was like the wars of Cortez and Pizarro for gold all over. And it made me very depressed. And then I went to Rio for Carnival, and I saw like thousands of people. They dress as beautifully as they can, and they're dancing in the streets and singing for days on end, you know. And it was a time when Brazil was in a very bad economic situation. I arrived, and you know, it was once in your life when you can see how beautiful and how joyous people could be together. And Brazil is a special country for that, because Brazil is really, the people of Brazil are a mix of the people of 3 continents. So they are Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans, and much intermarried. And for Carnival, it's not just upper class or middle class people. It's especially the poorest people who dance. And so I think, I mean, to me, it was a very, you know, just this, that once in your life you could see just how beautiful, because it's all about beauty and joy. It's not there's nothing commercial. There are no companies advertising. And I think most people don't realize that. even beauty. I think so many people think they're only my race is beautiful. You know, they don't see the beauty of Africans or Papuans or Japanese. I know a very intelligent woman. I mean, a woman I really like a great deal, and she's a philosopher. And she's always having philosophy meetings, mostly in Germany or else in Italy. And I told her often, why not the rest of the world? Why don't you have a meeting in Brazil or in Mexico or something like that, or in India? And she always says, well, I really don't. I'm not attracted to Asian men. You know, so I think that's widespread. But in Brazil, you see how beautiful. You know how beautiful people can be, and it's not just young people and beautiful people who participate in Carnival. It's I mean, there are people in wheelchairs. There are old people in wheelchairs who are dancing in the parade. And it's, you know, they see the beauty of the people, of all the people. I think this was, for me, it was a very important experience. I wanted to go often, and in the end, I did go. I did quite often go there. Yeah, of course, I grew up in a farm, so and I was very alone on this farm. So when I was a little boy, I would spend whole days just I would go hide somewhere in a ditch and spend the whole day looking at plants and insects and mice and so on. And I think I think now at this age, nature has become, you know, in a sense, more and more important. I mean, the best thing about this house is the 2 acres, you know, that I planted with so many kinds of bushes and trees, and that are visited by deer and chipmunks and squirrels and so on all the time. So I can't imagine moving into an apartment in the city. There was a wonderful walk in Sri Lanka with an old man, and we saw a leopard in nature. It's the only time I saw a leopard. And it was, and for him too, it was a special encounter. You know, he goes to this forest every day, but he wanted me to send a photograph of this leopard because it was in a special day. So the leopard was sprawled asleep on a branch, and when we came there, it kind of opens its eyes and looked at us, and contemptuously, and went back to sleep, thinking, oh, those are only human beings. Nothing of any interest. So we want, and he was like a cat, you know, every once in a while, kind of stretching and going back to sleep. Such an incredibly amazing animal. To see it in nature was wonderful. It was also wonderful to visit the penguin colonies in Antarctica. Because Antarctica is really an inhuman continent. You know, it's so hostile to human habitation. You know, it gets incredibly cold in the winter, so it's almost impossible for human beings ever to live there. There are only small colonies of scientists. So it's really a continent that belongs to the birds, to the penguins, and to the seals, and so on. So I visited in the summer, that is in February, when the penguins in great colonies were nesting, and where there were seals and walruses, these big sea animals. So I think it's the time when I felt most that it's their world, that I am only a visitor, you know. So in most places now, people own the land, and so we feel we're still in our world when we go. And of course, the ocean, you know, is diving. It's a marvelous world of hundreds of forms of life, the coral fish and all the invertebrates, the coral and the sponges and so on. And in the ocean, one is only a visitor. So, you know, when you're diving, it's not like, well, you know, since you've dived, it's not like swimming. You have fins, and you're moving like a fish and not like a human being. So you feel very much a temporary visitor in their world. And sometimes the fish are friendly, especially the angelfish, these big, beautiful fish. Very often, when you go down there, they follow you. And sometimes they come right up to your face, you know, and follow you for the whole hour of the trip. And you feel that they are companions for the time of your visit. So I think that to me, under the ocean was one of the most marvelous visits to nature. Well, certainly the practice of going away. It's, you know, when I was a small boy, my mother and father had come from Lithuania, and my mother had some education in Scotland, but my father had no education. And he came from the other side of the planet to America, and first he worked in factories, and then he worked on a farm, and finally was able to buy a small farm for himself. So that made a very big impression on me somehow. You know, later they didn't travel at all. You know, they stayed in the farm, and they would never even spend a single day in another outside their own beds. They never took a vacation. But I had the idea that, you know, that if he could go half around the world, you know, and end up having a perfectly good life, that I could also, that I could do, you know, I could see the world. And so first I did my education, and when I was in graduate school in Europe, I had no money, so I had no opportunity to go anywhere. But as soon as I got a job, then the first summer I wanted to start seeing the world. And I never got tired of it. And it seemed to me that constantly encountering new kinds of people in new places was really the most formative thing. Dream?
Yeah.
I don't think I dream as much as most people. I remember one time I was picked up, I was invited to give a talk in Canada. And the university was about 2 hours from the airport. And my host was teaching, so he sent his wife to pick me up at the airport. And And she told me about the dream she had that night. It took her 2 hours. You know, her dream was so complicated. It was like some amazing, epic story. And I remember I got so jealous. I thought, she has 8 hours more of life than I do. You know. So I started the practice of keeping a notebook at the bed. And as soon as I wake up, because, you know, the problem with dreams is that you forget them quickly after you wake up. So the only way is to write it down right away. And so I quickly discovered that I was dreaming more and more by doing that. So that if you valued your dreams, you know, you remember them. And you remember more and more of them. And finally, I was dreaming so much that it took me like all day to write them down. And then I got, you know, I was teaching, and I stopped doing this because I also had to prepare courses and do my job. And I did that a second time, you know, some years later, again, I did the same thing. So, and then when I moved here, I had a couple of very interesting dreams, and I decided to write them down. So now, in the last couple of years, I try to write down dreams that are especially interesting. You know, I write them, now it's easier because you can just write them down on the computer. When I was doing it back then, I had to write this down, all these dreams by hand, and it took a long time. But I think when I have the impression that other people dream, or at least remember their dreams, and or maybe dream more interesting dreams than I do. That's going to be hard. Well, I have this recurrent dream, but this is I don't want to tell this dream because it's a kind of miserable dream. So in this dream, I'm trying to cross a city square, like a plaza in some city. And as I start to cross, I get more and more terribly fatigued. And finally, I really can't put one foot in front of the other. I go down to try to go on all fours to cross the square. And I never succeed. And I wake up feeling a kind of anxiety. At the point when I'm almost paralyzed and can hardly move anymore. And I've had this dream, I don't know how many times. I think probably at least 10 times. It's somehow the same dream, and it has occurred, you know, over the years. So it's obviously a dream of trying to achieve something and failing, not being able to achieve something. And I never really, so it must be connected with something in my life that I'm trying to achieve and feeling that I cannot, that I'm failing. But I never really figured it out. I'm sorry to recall this kind of miserable dream because, you know, the typical dream that I write down is not miserable. Often it's magical and enchanting and happy. This is the only dream that has recurred. And I had it once about maybe 2 or 3 years ago here. But since I moved here, it's not very often that I've had this dream, but I'm not surprised if it would happen again. I don't know if there's anything new. I think it's the things that I've always wanted to achieve. So thinking is important. So I I really find it great. To me, it's somehow life to continue to think about something. So I'm always trying. I have this easy practice. When somebody asks me to write something or give a talk on some subject, especially if it's a subject I know nothing about, I always say yes. And it's an occasion to study and learn about something I know nothing about. And if I don't have this motivation, you always can. There are always things you're kind of curious about or wondering about or to think. So as long as I still have a mind, I'm sure I will continue to do that. And most of my books, I would write an essay or give a talk about subject, and then when I have a number of these, I would try to make a selection and see which are the better ones and write a book. So now I don't have a goal of especially writing another book, but I do have the goal of, as long as I can think and write, I will continue to try to write things. And maybe if I live a little bit more, there will be another book. I would like to continue to explore the world as long as I'm physically able. This winter I had really wanted to go to Iran. And I had been tried 3 times to get a visa in the past and never got a visa. But finally, I found a company that guaranteed me a visa. But now we have the virus and the country is closed. But usually I don't make plans. On a whim, I get some fanciful idea to go to a country and go there. So when I was teaching, I would go. I had to go at a certain time of year. I had to go in the summer. So, but now after I quit teaching, I thought, well, I could go anywhere at any time of the year. And the first summer, to escape the heat of the Baltimore summer, I decided to go to Mali. And, I never want to read anything about a country before I go there. I want that first impression of, wow. And when I went to Mali, I discovered it's the Sahara Desert, So to go there in the summer was not the best idea. And then one summer, I did one trip a few years ago. I decided to go to what's the country? Have you difficulty remembering the name of the country? What's the country on top of South Africa? Why am I not remembering this? Well, anyhow, I didn't know anything about this country, so I thought I'll go there and check it out. So when I go there, I discovered that it was the last country in South Africa to become independent. And so when they became independent, they were the poorest country in Africa. It was basically the Kalahari Desert. And then they discovered the biggest diamond mine ever. So if they would divide it equally, they would be the richest country in Africa. Of course, they don't do that. But anyhow, they are not interested in backpackers and low-end tourists. So I discovered it was very expensive. So the only way to visit the Kalahari Desert, you need a 4-wheel drive, a vehicle, and they were very expensive. Or else you can go in a group, which I didn't want to do. So I decided to go to the next country, Namibia. And I really didn't know anything about this country. I didn't even know how to pronounce it. And when I got there, I discovered that, first of all, it was a fantastic landscape. And secondly, that it was not expensive. And that I could rent an ordinary car and see most of the country. And, you know, as a sort of example, you know, I go on a whim. I don't make plans, and I think I've never been disappointed if I go to you know, a country that nobody else goes to, or that I never even heard of. Well, things. I first started to just buy things for the practical things for the house, like pots and pans and dishes and the stool you're sitting on, you know, simply because it was nice to buy them in another country, and secondly, I didn't want anything ugly in the house, so you know, and then sometimes I got gifts. So I started just occasionally getting gifts from people, and then every once in a while I came upon something that I thought, this is the only time I will ever see such an object. You know, like that fossilized stone axe, and that I could, you know, like there are a few things like that. I thought, I'll never see anything like this again. This is incredible that I ever even saw it, that I could see it. Some of the masks are that way. As for the dark things, for example, in my bedroom, these tankas, the two on either, the one right over my bed is the Buddha, but the one on the sides are both ferocious gods of Tibet, well, of Mongolia, more exactly. And some of these masks are ferocious. But I think there was a part of me that was always drawn to the dark sides, partly because, maybe simply because it's reality. And maybe I felt this more strongly in certain times. For example, the first time I went to India, where I saw so many desperately poor and suffering people. People had no bed, were sleeping on the street, and so on. And when I came back, nobody wanted to hear about it. It seems so many people don't want to talk about dark things. They just want to talk about frivolous things. Even, you know, educated people in my university. And I think I had a contempt for that. I think they're just sort of skimming over reality. For example, I was in India during the Bangladesh War, and I spent several months in what was then called Calcutta, now Kolkata, and the city was filled with refugees. And these people were just sleeping on the street. I was there for a couple months, and the night before I left, I went out for a walk, and after about a half hour, I was back in my room. I was just horrified, and so I didn't get used to it. And I was sleeping in a bed, and on the other side of the wall, on the street, there were people sleeping on the street. So that's a bad situation. And so a lot of people wouldn't go to India because they would feel that it's just depressing. But I felt that one has to live in reality. And I slept on a bed, even though those people were sleeping on the floor. And it doesn't change anything when I go 6,000 miles away and sleep in a bed in America, because I still know that those people are sleeping on the street. So, what I mean is that when I went to places that were full of poverty and suffering, and I saw the dark side of humanity and this world, I wanted to have my eyes open to see reality. Even if I couldn't, or I couldn't do very much. I mean, all I could do is give some money to people to eat. And in general, so some of these things represent and remind me of the dark side of things, like those two paintings in my bedroom. But I think if I would surrounded just with soft and sweet things, life would be very superficial. Well, so I do sort of. I guess in general, I feel that it's natural, and because every time there's a disaster, I mean, the newspapers always talk about how the community comes together to help. You know, they talk about that during the hurricane in New Orleans and every natural disaster. So I think it's very natural for people to help one another and be compassionate to one another. When I worked in that hospital in Chicago, when I was a student, you know, after that long night of that man dying, I was waiting for the bus, and there was a cleaning woman from that hospital. It was a black community, quite poor. And this cleaning, she was the lowest job in the hospital. She was just cleaning floors. And I didn't know her, but, you know, somehow she must have recognized me from the floor where the man had died. And there was this grief on her face. And so I think that's very natural for people to be compassionate, and so I think the people who are not compassionate are people who do something to themselves to try to live egotistical and frivolous life. You know, you think of so many families who have a child who is born crippled or blind, or, you know, and who spend their lives just caring for that child. Well, at the end of her life, when I was visiting my mother quite often, I met a neighbor family, and he was in the army in the Second War, and he married a British woman, and their child had some sort of pneumonia or something very young, and it was in the early days of penicillin, and then when they didn't know how much to give the child, and the doctors gave this child a massive dose of penicillin and destroyed her brain. And so this couple, they're working class family, very people with limited resources, but they devoted their lives caring for their daughter. And finally, when she really grew up and got strong, it was very difficult to care for her. She would get violent and things like that. So for a long time, they kept trying to keep her home and caring for her as it got more and more difficult. And finally, they had to put her in an institution, but still, every week they take her out and bring her home. When you think of something like that, they devoted their whole life to a very needy human being. So I think that really there are a lot of people who do that. I had this experience in my town. I was keeping fish, so I needed supplies for the fish tank, and somebody told me there was this cheaper place, and so I went there, and it was in somebody's basement, and I would always go there when I needed something for my fish tank. And so I became really good friends with the man. He was a working class man and worked in the factory, but he was a very nice person, and I liked him very much. And his wife was more remote. Sometimes she was there, and she was kind and friendly, but, I didn't really have this personal encounter. So after 6 or 7 years, I discovered from outside that their only child had cystic fibrosis. So this is this horrible disease that most people died in infancy. Most people, it chokes up your lungs and you can't breathe. And most people with this disease, they died in infancy. And her daughter was doomed. Nobody lives a full life with this disease. The longest anyone ever lived was 40 years. And so they knew she would die. But they cared for her. And eventually she died about the age of 25. But so for 25 years, this couple cared for this very needy child. And that's why they had that little fish store in the basement, because to raise the little money. And then the wife also raised houseplants. So she sold houseplants that she raised. All this to get a little extra money to support their daughter. They never told me this, even though I became good friends with the father. But when I would think about that, I would think, what does that mean? When you have a child, you give it all the love you have in order that the child become a loving person and live a loving life outside of your care. They gave all the love they had to this child who would never, find somebody to love. To be a parent is to teach your child everything you know. And that's what they did. And the child would die. I think it's extraordinary compassion. And, if you would ask someone why they did that, sometimes you hear about very rich people. For example, Kennedy had a sister who was born, I think she was autistic. They put her in an institution. So rich people often do that. And if you would ask this mother why she didn't put her daughter in an institution, I think she would say something very simple. She would say, it's mother. She wouldn't talk about money or how much it costs or how it would, compress her life. So I think she would, is my daughter, you know. I think that's all, it was that simple for her, I think. Or at least that's what I imagine, you know, like I never really, anyhow, I think care, compassion is natural, and the people who are not compassionate, who are cruel, have been damaged in some way. Of course, you know, everybody says that people who are cruel are often had been cruelly treated when they were children. And then there are people who are just sociopaths, who just have no feeling because of a, you know, brain deficiency. Yeah, I think in our capitalist world, we have the idea that everybody acts to get something for themselves. And I think that's so false. I think just in an ordinary life, all the time, we do something to someone else and not expect anything in return. A simple thing like asking directions, giving directions. You know, a stranger stops you and asks directions, and you're happy to spend a couple minutes helping that person, and you will never see that person again, and you'll get nothing in return. So I think it happens all the time. I just think an ordinary trip to the store, I'm thinking of the hardware store. So many times I go to the store, and these working class people who have do all the repairs of plumbing and electricity in their own house, they're very happy to help me. So I think people are giving gifts all the time and not expecting anything for return. I think maybe the most striking example is to accompany someone who is going nowhere, who is dying. For me personally, the most touching experience is when my mother was dying. And she had a friend who was with her, actually to the death. So my mother had a cancer, and she lived 4 months after that. And so this friend, every time she was in the hospital, the friend visited her. And then the friend went to, you know, she was feeling okay, and her friend had an opportunity to visit a friend in Mexico, in Acapulco. And then my mother took a bad turn, and it was clear that it was getting toward the end. So my mother's friend took the first plane back. I remember she even arrived in the middle of the night, and the first thing she did is to visit my mother. And then towards the last days, she was there 24 hours on my mother's bedside. And she gave me strength. I think I would have found it much more difficult without her example and her, you know, her friendship to accompany my mother as she it was very hard because the doctor said she won't suffer. They gave her, you know, anesthesias, and they said she's not suffering. But didn't think that was true. I mean, it seems to me that they put her in a unconscious, but her whole body was in agony. She was gasping for air. Yeah, and so my mother's friend had held her arm for about 3 days, 24 hours, without ever leaving her. I think to leave people to die alone, that would be the worst condition in society. If there were a society where people were allowed to just die alone, that would be an inhuman society. And again, I think that's to accompany someone who is dying. Again, I think it's natural. I think it's a sort of natural thing to do. Now most people in our culture die in hospitals, but before that, people died at home, surrounded by their loved ones. So I think it's natural. I don't think about it very much. I really don't think of how it's going to happen. I don't think about it. But that one time when I was very, very sick in India, and one day I was climbing the cliffs and visiting the cliff temples, and 24 hours later I had lost 95% of my strength. I thought the rest of it would go. It seemed to me logical to think that. And at that time, I didn't feel fear. I really didn't. I didn't panic. I didn't think I should do something, that I should find better doctors or go back to the United States or anything. But I also felt that I had lived the life I wanted. And I didn't feel fear. The next time it comes, I don't know what will happen. I don't think one can predict. I guess most people hope that it will happen either in your sleep or in a heart attack. What you don't want it to be months in a hospital bed, in a coma, with tubes artificially keeping you breathing. But like that woman, when my mother was in the hospital the last time, she said, "Go visit that woman down the hall. She knew you when you were a boy." And I visited this woman, and the first thing she told me is that she had leukemia, and it's incurable, and she is back in the hospital from time to time, and it gets worse. And she just told me that right away to get it off the table. And then she wanted to talk about other things. She wanted to ask me what I've been doing all these years, and to tell me all the news from the town. And, to me, it made such a strong impression that this woman was perfectly brave. She was in a very bad condition physically, but she, was not whining. She was not crying. She faced reality. She was not deluding herself. And that gave me to think that we are more courageous than we realize. That if we think ahead, we will panic, But imagine wondering if we will have how we will feel when the time comes. But I think that that experience gave me to believe that we have more courage than we know. Somehow deep down we have a basic fundamental courage, and since it is the destiny of all human beings to die, we have the courage to accept it.